Have you ever wondered, like really wondered, if we can truly grasp the essence of life by just picking it apart piece by piece? Like taking a beautiful, intricate tapestry and trying to understand its beauty by just analyzing each individual thread. I think it's a question that sits with anyone who thinks about the nature of reality, and especially, I would imagine, for someone like you with a background in philosophy. Today, we're going deep on reductionism, not just as a scientific method, but as a philosophical idea when applied to the world of biology.
Definitely. The idea of breaking things down into smaller parts, it's very powerful, right? In science and philosophy, it's tempting. But when we're talking about something as complex and dynamic as a living organism trying to reduce, it opens up a whole world of questions. And that's exactly what this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry lays out so well. It goes beyond simple definitions and dives into the different ways we can even think about reducing life, the history of these debates, the problems that come up, and some really interesting alternative viewpoints that have emerged over time. So that's what we'll be exploring today.
Makes sense. And this entry on reductionism in biology, it's a great choice because it really gets into the nitty-gritty. It doesn't just tell us what reductionism is, it explores the different levels of reduction from the actual physical stuff to the way biologists study things and the knowledge they build. It even takes us back in time to see how these ideas developed. But maybe before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. What is reductionism exactly in the context of biology?
So when we talk about reductionism in biology, we're essentially talking about the relationship between different levels of scientific inquiry. It's asking, can we really understand or explain what's happening at one level, like the level of an organism or a cell, by looking at what's happening at a more basic fundamental level, like the level of molecules or even physics. Imagine trying to understand consciousness, which is this complex phenomenon, by studying the activity of neurons in the brain. That's kind of the idea behind reductionism.
Okay, that makes sense. We break things down to their building blocks to understand how they work as a whole. Now, the entry talks about three different types of reduction. Can you walk us through those and explain what makes each one philosophically interesting?
Absolutely. First, we have what's called ontological reduction. It's a pretty bold claim about what living things are at their core. The idea is that biological systems, even though they seem super complex, are ultimately just collections of molecules interacting according to the laws of physics. Philosophically, this often lines up with physicalism. This is the idea that ultimately everything that exists is physical. The entry mentions two important concepts here. Supervenience, which means that any change in the biological properties of something has to be caused by a change in its underlying physical properties, and token reduction, which says that every specific instance of a biological thing or event is identical to some specific physical thing or event. This is a very different view than vitalism, which was a popular idea in the past that said there were special non-physical forces at play in living organisms.
So basically, if we look at a cell, ontologically speaking, it's just molecules being molecules arranged in a particular way. That's a pretty profound statement. And what's the next type of reduction?
The second type is methodological reduction. This is about how we go about studying biological systems. It's the approach of looking at things at the most basic level possible, focusing on molecular and biochemical processes, and breaking complex systems down into their parts to analyze them. Think as a scientist studying the DNA sequence of a gene to figure out its role in development. Now, here's where things get tricky. The entry makes it clear that believing in ontological reduction, that everything is ultimately physical, doesn't mean you have to use methodological reduction as your only way of studying biology. Some people argue that focusing solely on the lower levels can make you miss important patterns and properties that only emerge at higher levels of organization.
Right. Just because a flock of birds is made of atoms doesn't mean we can understand how the flock moves by just studying individual atoms.
Mhm.
And so the third type deals with knowledge itself, right? Epistemic reduction.
It's exactly. Epistemic reduction is all about whether knowledge from one scientific domain can be completely explained by knowledge from another. This is where a lot of the really interesting philosophical debates happen in the philosophy of biology. The entry talks about two main categories within epistemic reduction: theory reduction and explanatory reduction. It's asking whether theories and explanations in fields like genetics or ecology can be fully explained by, or even replaced by, theories and explanations from a more fundamental field like molecular biology or physics. It's about the relationship between our conceptual frameworks and how we explain things in science.
Got it. So we've got the what it is, ontology, the how we study it, methodology, and what we know about it, epistemology. And then the entry takes us on a historical tour showing how these ideas have been around for a long time. It's not just a modern thing.
Right. And two themes keep popping up throughout history: the relationship between different branches of knowledge and the relationship between parts and wholes. These themes are directly related to both our ontological and epistemic views. And, as is so often the case, we can trace these ideas back to, well, who else but Aristotle?
Of course, Aristotle, always laying the foundation. What did he have to say about this interplay of parts, wholes, and different fields of knowledge?
So Aristotle had this idea of superordinate and subordinate sciences, which was an early attempt to figure out how different areas of knowledge relate to each other. But for Aristotle, this relationship wasn't necessarily about reducing one to the other in the way we think about it today. He didn't believe there was one, ultimate science, to which everything else could be reduced. When it came to parts and wholes, Aristotle emphasized that you need to consider both the material parts and the function or purpose of the whole thing. His biology, with its focus on teleology, is often seen as anti-reductionist, at least in the ontological sense. He didn't think the organization and function of a living thing could be boiled down to just the properties of its parts. However, he also recognized that the material composition of a thing does impose limitations on its form and function. He even explored the idea that the same material could serve different functions depending on the needs of the whole.
Interesting. A view that considers both the material basis and the functional whole. And then, as we move into the early modern period, we see the rise of mechanistic philosophy. How did thinkers like Descartes and Boyle grapple with these ideas?
Well, the early modern period was a time of big shift towards mechanistic explanations, especially with Descartes. He was a huge proponent of the idea that you could explain natural phenomena, including living organisms, except maybe the human mind, just in terms of matter and motion, without bringing in any ideas of purpose or teleology. He even tried to give mechanistic explanations for things like the heartbeat and how embryos develop. Boyle, he was also big on the mechanical philosophy, but he tried to find a way to reconcile it with the idea of purpose and function. He suggested that mechanistic explanations could actually help us understand function and purpose better.
So, a move towards mechanism, but still trying to make sense of the role of function. And then we get to Kant, who always seems to complicate things in a fascinating way. What did he bring to the table in this debate?
Ah, Kant. He was a master at weaving together seemingly opposing ideas. In his critique of judgment, he talks about this tension between our natural inclination to think teleologically about living things, seeing them as having purposes, and the mechanistic principles of physics that govern the material world. Basically, he separated epistemology from metaphysics. He argued that we need to understand how organisms work in terms of their contribution to the whole, which sounds anti-reductionist, right? But he also held a kind of ontological reductionism, believing that at the most fundamental level, all causation was linear and mechanical. But crucially for Kant, this underlying mechanical causality was a category of how our minds structure experience. So it wasn't the same as the strong physicalism that's often discussed today. He famously said that organisms are natural purposes, things that we can only truly grasp by considering their organization and the goals they seem to be striving towards.
So, with Kant, even if the underlying reality is ultimately mechanistic, the way we know biology might require a non-reductive teleological perspective. A subtle but important point. And what about the 19th century? The entry mentions quite a variety of viewpoints emerging during that time.
Yes, the 19th century saw a real mix of mechanist and organicist viewpoints, reflecting the ongoing philosophical debates about reductionism and holism. You had some scientists drawing inspiration from physics and its explanatory power, while others stressed the idea of emergent properties, arguing that you couldn't just reduce life to its basic components. Even within physiology, where the metaphor of the body as a machine gained traction, there was a recognition that studying parts in isolation could only take you so far.
This brings us to the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the famous debate over vitalism, with figures like Hans Driesch playing a key role.
This debate really heated up around the question of biological development, especially embryology. Even as science was generally moving towards mechanistic explanations, Driesch's work on the amazing ability of embryos to regenerate missing parts raised some serious challenges. It's important to understand that this debate wasn't just about whether there were literal, non-physical forces at play, but also about how best to explain the remarkable order and self-organization that we see in living things. The theme of organization became central, with thinkers like Needham, Goldstein, Russell, and others all grappling with the tension between reductionist and holistic approaches.
It seems like these early 20th century thinkers were paving the way for more rigorous, formal philosophical analyses of reductionism, and that's where Ernest Nagel and his book The Structure of Science come in.
Absolutely. Nagel was the first to offer a really systematic and comprehensive account of reductionism, all within the framework of logical empiricism, which was a major philosophical movement at the time. His work was crucial because he went beyond just arguing for or against reduction in general. He actually proposed a precise, logical model for how one scientific theory could be reduced to another. He carefully examined the logical connections between theories, that theme of how different areas of knowledge relate, and he engaged directly with the biological literature on parts, wholes, and emergence. He didn't shy away from the conceptual problems with saying that the whole is just the sum of its parts, and he looked at the complexities of how new traits arise in evolution and the hierarchical organization of living systems.
So he provided a solid framework. Can you explain the basics of his model for theory reduction and its key components?
Nagel, working within this logical empiricist view of theories as systems of axioms, proposed that one theory, let's call it TB, the theory being reduced, could be reduced to another theory, TA, the reducing theory, if and only if you could logically derive the laws of TB from the laws of TA. He called this the condition of derivability. But he realized there was a problem. Theory often uses terms and concepts that aren't even found in theory, TA. So to solve this, he added the condition of connectability, which required creating what he called bridge principles. These are statements that link the terms of TA and TB either by definition or by describing how they relate to each other. Basically, these bridge principles act as a translation key between the two theories, allowing us to derive from TA plus these bridge principles.
So the bridge principles are what connect the dots. And did Nagel see this primarily as a relationship between different kinds of knowledge without making strong claims about the underlying reality?
That's exactly right. Nagel was really focused on the logical and epistemic connections between scientific theories. He wanted to understand how different areas of scientific knowledge could be integrated and unified without necessarily saying anything definitive about the ultimate nature of reality. His model could be applied to what's called interlevel reduction, like reducing biology to physics, and also to what's called successional reduction, where a later, more complete theory reduces an earlier, less complete one, which is often seen as a sign of scientific progress.
A neat and logical picture. But of course, it faced some significant challenges, especially from thinkers like Feyerabend and Kuhn, who pointed out that the history of science is often a lot messier than this model suggests. What were their main criticisms of Nagel, particularly regarding this idea of successional reduction?
Feyerabend and Kuhn, with their groundbreaking work on the history of science, brought up this very important idea of incommensurability. They argued that as scientific theories change and evolve over time, the meanings of key terms can change so drastically that the concepts in the old theory become incompatible with those in the new theory. Think about the concept of mass before and after Einstein's theory of relativity. It's not the same thing. And if the meaning of the terms themselves is shifting, then those bridge principles that Nagel relied on become really problematic. You can't just logically derive one theory from another if they're talking about fundamentally different things. While there's still debate about just how widespread and significant incommensurability is, it definitely posed a major challenge to the idea that scientific progress is always about smoothly reducing older theories to newer ones.
And then came Schaffner, who built upon Nagel's ideas, especially when looking at the relationship between classical genetics and molecular biology. What was his general reduction model, and how did it try to address some of these criticisms?
Schaffner was aware of this problem highlighted by folks like Feyerabend, that the older theories, the ones being reduced, often have errors or are even straight up wrong in some ways. And you can't logically derive a false statement from a set of true statements. That's just basic logic. So to deal with this, Schaffner introduced the concept of what he called TBE, which is basically a revised, improved version of the theory being reduced. It's been cleaned up to get rid of those inaccuracies. So according to Schaffner, reduction happens when the reducing theory, our TA, which could be molecular biology, is connected to this corrected, reduced theory, maybe a refined version of classical genetics, through what he called reduction functions. These are a bit more flexible than Nagel's bridge principles, often expressing things like approximate identities or structural similarities between the entities and processes described by the two theories. If you can derive from TA plus these reduction functions, then you've achieved reduction. Unlike Nagel, Schaffner thought these reduction functions could actually reflect real underlying ontological identities, although not necessarily identities that are absolutely necessary. And he famously argued that the successes of molecular biology were in fact leading to the reduction of classical genetics,
to biochemistry.
So, a more adaptable model that acknowledges that the reduced theory might need some tweaking and suggests a deeper connection between the different levels. But the entry also mentions a number of criticisms specifically aimed at the Nagel-Schaffner model, especially when applied to biology. What were some of the key issues raised by philosophers of biology?
Yeah, there were a few major points of contention. First, people like Roos and Hull argued that the actual historical relationship between classical and molecular genetics didn't really look like reduction. They said it looked more like the newer theory simply replaced the older one. Even with Schaffner's corrected theory, the question remained, how much could you really change classical genetics before it became a completely different theory, one that just happened to be better than the original, rather than being logically derived from molecular biology? Some also felt that Schaffner's idea of strong analogy as a requirement for reduction wasn't specific enough. The second criticism, raised by philosophers like Kitcher and Sarkar, was that molecular biology itself, the supposed reducing theory, didn't really fit this neat axiomatic picture of a scientific theory. They argued that molecular biology is more like a collection of models, mechanisms, and experimental techniques, rather than this formally structured system of laws. And if that's the case, then the whole idea of logically deriving one theory from another becomes a lot more complicated. Lastly, philosophers like Hall, Wimsatt, and Sarkar criticized the Nagel-Schaffner model for being too focused on this abstract, in principle, possibility of reduction and not paying enough attention to how science is actually done. They felt that this focus on the logical structure of scientific knowledge missed the messy realities of how scientific discoveries are made and how different levels of explanation actually work together in biological research.
It sounds like this elegant, logical model clashed with the more pragmatic and multifaceted reality of how biologists actually work. And that leads us to the idea of explanatory reduction, which takes a different approach. How does it differ from this focus on the logical connections between whole theories?
Right, so explanatory reduction shifts the focus away from deriving entire theories, and instead asks whether we can explain specific biological phenomena happening at a higher level by appealing to entities and processes at a lower level. It moves away from this idea that reduction is all about logical deduction and embraces a more intuitive notion of understanding something complex by breaking it down and seeing how its parts work. There are two key differences here. First, explanatory reduction isn't limited to just full-fledged theories. It can apply to individual generalizations, mechanisms, or even specific facts. And second, it often assumes that this kind of reductive explanation is really about causal explanation. We understand how a higher-level system behaves by figuring out the causal roles and interactions of its lower-level components.
So instead of trying to derive all of Mendelian genetics from molecular biology, we might aim to explain a specific inheritance pattern by looking at the molecular mechanisms of how DNA is copied, how genes are expressed, and how chromosomes separate during cell division.
Exactly. The entry talks about Kenneth Waters' work, which looks at how a core principle of classical genetics, the idea that differences in genes cause differences in traits, can be explained by identifying the actual causal pathways at the molecular level. He emphasizes how the development of molecular genetics has given us new tools to investigate these things, leading to more detailed and mechanistic explanations for phenomena that were previously described in more abstract ways. This focus on uncovering the mechanisms becomes crucial in this view of reduction. Philosophers like Kaufman, Wimsatt, Bechtel, and Richardson argue that this focus on mechanisms is a more accurate reflection of how biologists actually go about explaining things.
And the shift to mechanisms potentially lets us get around some of the tricky issues that came up with theory reduction, like needing these perfectly structured theories and the disconnect from how science is actually done.
That's the idea. By focusing on explaining specific biological phenomena in a piecemeal way, by figuring out the underlying mechanisms, explanatory reduction allows for the fact that biological knowledge often progresses in a more fragmented and context-dependent way. We can achieve reductive explanations for certain aspects of a system, even if we can't fully reduce an entire higher-level theory to a lower-level one. Also, because mechanistic explanations are so closely tied to the actual discovery of those mechanisms, this approach is much better at capturing how scientific discovery actually happens, something that the abstract logical framework of theory reduction struggled with.
The entry then goes into some specific models of explanatory reduction, like Wimsatt's concept of compositional redescription and Sarkar's distinction between abstract and spatial hierarchical reduction. Can you give us a quick rundown of these different approaches?
Wimsatt focuses on this idea that when we explain something happening at a higher level, we often do it by providing a compositional redescription of the system. We describe the lower level parts, how they're organized, and how they interact.
to produce that higher level behavior. He introduces the concept of effective screening off, which means that sometimes, once you understand the lower level causes, the higher level descriptions become irrelevant for certain purposes. He also talks about the cost of explanation. Even if we can give a lower level description, sometimes a higher level one might be better because it's simpler or more general. Sarkar, on the other hand, emphasizes the way we represent biological systems when we're trying to reduce them. He distinguishes between what he calls abstract hierarchical reduction, like in classical genetics where genes are these abstract entities with rules of inheritance, and what he calls strong or spatial hierarchical reduction, which is more like molecular biology, where you're describing things in terms of the actual physical arrangement and interactions of molecules. He argues that molecular biology provides a spatial hierarchical reduction that ultimately explains the mechanisms behind the more abstract descriptions of classical genetics.
So, Winsat is all about describing the system in terms of its parts and the trade-offs involved in explaining things at different levels. Sarkar, meanwhile, is focused on how we represent those different levels and how those representations make reduction possible. The entry then dives into what it calls problems with reductionism, starting with the context dependence of molecular features, what's often called the one-many relationship. What's the main challenge that this poses for reductionism?
This one-many problem basically highlights the fact that how a particular molecule or mechanism behaves can depend heavily on the specific biological context. The same gene, for instance, can produce different traits depending on the organism's overall genetic makeup, its developmental history, or even the environment it's in. This means that you can't just understand the role of a part in isolation. Its function and effects depend on the complex organization and interactions happening within the larger whole. This is very reminiscent of some of Kant's ideas about how interconnected everything is in an organism.
And this dependence on context makes it hard to give straightforward reductionist explanations because a single molecular account might not be enough to predict or explain the variety of outcomes we see at the higher level.
Exactly. People who defend theory reduction might say, well, in principle, you can include all these contextual factors as initial conditions in your grand molecular theory. But critics point out that it would be practically impossible to actually specify all of those lower-level details, even if you assume that ontological reduction is true. This makes the idea of completely deriving higher-level biology from a purely molecular perspective seem incredibly unlikely. Explanatory reduction does a little better here because it's focused on explaining specific causal pathways in specific contexts. You can gain valuable insights without having to describe the entire system in molecular detail. But even mechanistic explanations can struggle to account for those emergent behaviors that arise from the interactions of many context-dependent components.
The second big problem discussed is the many-one issue, the multiple realization of higher-level features. This sounds like another big hurdle for reductionist approaches.
Oh, it is. Multiple realization is the observation that the same higher-level biological property, function, or even type of organism can be produced by different underlying molecular mechanisms. Think about digestion, for instance. It happens in very different ways, using different sets of organs and biochemical processes in different species. This poses a challenge for both theory reduction and explanatory reduction because it messes up that neat one-to-one correspondence between higher and lower levels that they're looking for.
Theory reduction, especially this goal of reducing higher-level categories or types to specific lower-level types, seems particularly vulnerable to the problem of multiple realization.
Absolutely. The work of philosopher Jerry Fodor on token versus type reduction is crucial here. While most people agree on token reduction, which means that any specific instance of a higher level property is also some instance of a physical property, type reduction, which says that each kind of higher level property corresponds to a specific kind of lower level property. That seems to be empirically false for many biological categories, precisely because of multiple realization. This often leads to what are called disjunctive bridge principles. Instead of linking a higher level type to a single lower level type, you end up saying it corresponds to this type or that type or another type and so on. Critics argue that this kind of disjunctive reduction doesn't have the explanatory power and unity we would expect from a real reduction. It doesn't point to a single common underlying mechanism or principle at the lower level. Philosopher Philip Kitcher, for instance, has argued that sometimes a higher-level theory, like how cytology explains genetics through the behavior of chromosomes, might actually give you a more unified and causally relevant explanation than disjunctive molecular account.
But the entry also points out that sometimes focusing on those lower-level molecular details can actually reveal important distinctions that we might miss at the higher level.
That's true. Philosophers like Waters and Sober argue that we shouldn't just assume that a unified explanation at a higher level is always better than a more complex, disjunctive one at a lower level. They say that in some cases, the very fact that a higher level phenomenon can be realized in multiple ways, each with its own specific molecular details, might be scientifically important. And the only way to capture these differences is by looking at those lower level explanations. They remind us that explanations can serve different goals, and sometimes those gory details at the molecular level provide a depth of understanding that you just wouldn't get from a more general, higher level account.
And even within the framework of mechanistic explanations, which often focus on explaining specific instances or tokens of a phenomenon, the broader goal in many areas of biology, like developmental biology, is to understand types of phenomena across different organisms.
Exactly. You might have a mechanistic explanation for how a particular developmental event happens in a specific organism, which is a token-level explanation. But developmental biologists are also trying to figure out the general principles and mechanisms of development that apply across many different species. And multiple realization makes it really hard to give a single, lower-level explanation for these general principles because the molecular machinery involved can vary quite a bit, even when the developmental processes are functionally similar. In fact, sometimes the explanations at the higher level, focusing on things like conserved developmental modules or signaling pathways, can be more robust and generalizable. They hold true even when there are variations at the molecular level. The idea of explanatory relevance, as emphasized by philosophers like Stravens and Craver, becomes very important here. And the fact that some higher-level entities remain stable even as their molecular components change over time, as pointed out by Brigitte, Kirschner, and Mitchell, further supports the need for explanations that operate at these higher levels.
The last set of problems discussed in the entry have to do with representation, temporality, and intrinsicality. These seem to add yet another layer of complexity to this whole debate.
For sure. Sarkar makes this point that whenever you try to give a reductive explanation, you're making choices about how to represent the biological system you're studying. And the success or failure of your reduction can depend heavily on the type of representation you choose. Are you taking a fundamentalist approach, where you only care about the most basic level? Are you using an abstract hierarchical representation that focuses on different levels of organization? Or are you using a spatial hierarchical representation that emphasizes the physical structure of things? The way those one many and many one problems we talked about actually show up can depend on how you choose to represent things. Wimsatt also reminds us that reduction and emergence aren't always opposed to each other. When you consider how complexly organized biological systems are, different ways of breaking down a system can reveal different aspects of how it behaves, and can even lead to the discovery of emergent properties.
What about temporality and intrinsicality? Why are those important for understanding the limits of reductionism?
So traditionally, most discussions of reductionism have focused on these synchronic compositional relationships. It's all about how the parts make up the whole in a single point in time. But the diachronic, or temporal aspects, how biological processes actually unfold over time and how different levels interact causally across time, those have often been ignored. The entry brings up this idea of temporal hierarchy as another important dimension of representation, showing how the same explanation can be considered reductive or non-reductive, depending on the temporal relationships between entities and processes at different levels. It uses the example of how asymmetry develops in the aortic arch to illustrate this, showing how temporal relationships can actually be both reductive and non-reductive within the same explanation. The example of how proteins fold further emphasizes the importance of temporal and causal factors beyond just the amino acids that make up the protein. And then there's intrinsicality, which is about how we decide what's part of a biological system and what's part of its environment, and how we assign causal responsibility to those internal versus external factors. Methodological reductionism often focuses on those internal parts, but many biological processes are deeply intertwined with their environment. Recognizing these different representational features, including temporality and intrinsicality, really highlights the fact that reductionism isn't a single unified concept, but rather a whole set of strategies and claims that need to be carefully considered.
This brings us to the discussion of alternatives to reductionism presented in the entry. It seems like all the limitations we've been talking about, along with the incredible diversity of fields within biology, have led philosophers to look for other ways to understand how these different areas relate, instead of just focusing on reduction.
Exactly. The entry points out that many philosophers of biology are moving away from this idea that reduction is the only, or even the main,
way to integrate and understand different parts of biology. Concepts like coordination, integration, and synthesis are becoming more important. The historical example of what are called interfield theories, like the chromosome theory of inheritance, which brought together Mendelian genetics and cytology, shows how we can make huge scientific leaps by bridging different fields without strictly reducing one to the other. More recent work stresses the dynamic ways in which different levels of organization interact and the idea of synthesizing knowledge from different sources instead of just assuming that everything ultimately reduces to a more fundamental level.
The idea of a problem agenda driving interdisciplinary research sounds really interesting.
It is. Philosopher Alan Love talks about this problem agenda, arguing that specific scientific questions or puzzles can actually bring researchers from different disciplines together and provide a framework for coordinating all the knowledge and perspectives they bring to the table. And Brigham goes even further, arguing that there's no fixed hierarchy among scientific disciplines. How they interact and inform each other depends on the specific problem being investigated. This problem-driven view emphasizes that the need for integration and coordination comes from the scientific questions we're trying to answer, rather than some overarching commitment to a unified, reductionist worldview.
The rise of mechanisms as a central concept in biology also seems to provide a way to think about integration without necessarily invoking reduction.
Definitely. Many philosophers of biology see the identification and characterization of mechanisms as a fundamental goal of biological research. This approach fits really well with how biologists actually work, and it doesn't rely on this notion of a formal theory that needs to be reduced to another theory. Mechanisms can also serve as these bridges between different fields, as philosopher Lindley Darden has argued in the case of classical and molecular genetics, where both fields contribute to our understanding of the molecular mechanisms of inheritance. The mechanisms framework can also handle explanations that span multiple levels in multiple fields, capturing the complexity of biological systems by detailing how components at different levels work together to produce a particular phenomenon.
And the entry touches on how the complexity of living systems, especially phenomena like self-organization, have led to non-reductionist accounts of how we gain knowledge in biology.
Right. Thinkers like Winsat and Mitchell argue that certain features of biological complexity just don't fit well with traditional reductionist approaches. Self-organization, where you have higher-level order and patterns emerging from local interactions between lower-level components without any central control, shows how system-level behaviors can arise from these dynamic interactions, rather than being determined by the properties of the individual parts in isolation. Systems biology, with its focus on system-wide behavior and the complex networks of molecular interactions, also grapples with these non-reductionist themes like emergent properties and the robustness of biological systems.
And finally, the entry mentions some critiques from feminist philosophy of science and social studies of science, which offer a broader perspective on the issue of reductionism.
These perspectives bring up really important questions about the historical, social, and even ideological context in which reductionist approaches have been favored. They argue that reductionism isn't always neutral or objective. It can be intertwined with larger social and political goals, which can shape the questions we ask and the types of explanations we find convincing. They also emphasize how important it is to consider higher levels of organization, like social and environmental factors, when studying complex biological phenomena, particularly in fields like public health. They argue that focusing solely on the molecular level can sometimes make us miss crucial causal factors.
So it seems like all these alternatives to reductionism share this commitment to what's called epistemological pluralism, the idea that we need a diverse set of concepts, methods, explanations to understand the multifaceted nature of life, without insisting that everything must ultimately be grounded in a single, most fundamental level of analysis.
Absolutely. These perspectives highlight what's been called the epistemological profligacy of successful biological inquiry. The willingness to use whatever conceptual and methodological tools work best for answering the biological questions we're interested in, even if those tools span multiple levels of organization and don't fit neatly into a hierarchical reductionist framework. The sheer diversity of biological research really pushes us towards a more pluralistic view of biology, acknowledging that there are many valid and insightful ways to understand and explain the living world.
This has been a really fascinating and insightful deep dive into a complex topic. Just to recap, we've talked about different kinds of reductionism, the historical development of these ideas, those really thought-provoking critiques about the challenges of context dependence and multiple realization, the importance of how we represent biological systems, and the rise of alternative perspectives that stress integration, mechanisms, and a more pluralistic view of biological knowledge. It seems like this question of whether we can truly break life down into its parts isn't a simple yes or no, but leads us to a much richer understanding of how explanation itself works.
Couldn't agree more. Thinking about reductionism in biology really forces us to confront some of those fundamental questions in philosophy. Questions about how we explain things, the nature of scientific unity, the relationship between different levels of reality, and the very character of biological knowledge itself. It's a reminder that even seemingly straightforward scientific concepts often have these hidden layers of philosophical depth.
So, as you, our listener, continue pondering all of this, I'll leave you with one final thought. Given all the complexity, the context dependence, and the multiple realizability that seem to be inherent to living systems, is it even possible to come up with a single, overarching explanation for all of biology? Or should we embrace a more pluralistic and integrative approach that sees the value of explanations that operate at different levels of organization? I have a feeling that our deep dive today has only scratched the surface of this incredibly profound and ongoing intellectual journey.